continuing our study through Hebrews, and this is a really good passage. I'd say one of the themes, or the theme, of this section. Speaking of Hebrews, if you need a Bible, put up your hand. John, put one in your hand. Sorry. As we consider this passage, this section of Hebrews, there's a theme in it, and that theme is one of growth, of progress, of starting in one place and ending up in a different place, progressing, going forward. It's the theme of much of the book, and especially of these passages. All of us have progressed and grown, and the section that we're looking at, this paragraph, is about that same topic. It's about progression. It's about starting at one location, but if you stay there your whole life, it's not a good thing. The goal is to get from point A to point B. And here, spiritually, he's talking about their Christian lives. And the author of this letter is writing to a group of Christians, and he's encouraging them to continue on in that faith, that progression, the profession of faith. The beginning of faith is supposed to lead to a progression of faith, a growth in faith. And so as we consider this passage, my prayer is that we would not just be hearing about growing in our faith, but actually growing. So as we've been looking through Hebrews over the past months, we've seen that the author, this writer, has a train of thought. And he's writing, and I guess the real theme of all of Hebrews. Where's the clicker? Liam, is the clicker next to you? Thanks. Could you click it? Or I'll tell you what I'll do. The real theme, I guess, in Hebrews is the supremacy of Christ. And that's what we've kind of titled this series. Over the next 6 months, maybe more, we'll be looking at this. And the theme almost every week is the supremacy of Christ and how Jesus is better than everything. And he's been trying to convince and remind his hearers of this. And then he begins a train of thought about how Jesus is greater than the Old Testament system of sacrifices and the Old Testament priesthood and the Old Testament high priest. And they've just been considering that. Even as we sang, a lot of the songs that we began the service was on that train of thought. Just considering how Jesus is the true priest and the true king, and he's the great high priest whose name is love. And as we consider these things, we're along the train of thought of Hebrews. And then he changes the topic, sort of. You can see that in verse 11. He says, about this, we have much to say. He introduces in verse 10, he says that Jesus has been designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he begins this train of thought, this noble and wonderful thought about how Jesus is like that Old Testament priest king named Melchizedek. And he's like about to talk about it, and then he's like, I have much to say about this, but it's hard to explain. I can't really get into it right now. Why? Why does he say that? Is it something that the author of Hebrews feels like he's incapable of describing? No, because all of chapter 7 is describing it. So when he says it's hard to explain this idea of Jesus as the high priest, like unto after Melchizedek, he says it's not hard to explain as in it's impossible for him to find the right words, because he finds the right words in chapter 7. Attention. So when he says it's hard to explain, he doesn't mean it's a problem with him, nor does he mean it's a problem with his topic. He says it's hard for me to explain this, and the reason he's getting there is it's not my fault, it's your fault. It's hard to explain this topic. He realizes, almost maybe like mid-sentence or mid-paragraph, he reminds himself that these people aren't really paying attention. And then he kind of realizes, well, it's not just lately, it's like always. They're not really paying attention to what I'm saying, to what I'm getting across. There's that famous scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's Ben Stein, the kind of archetypal boring teacher, and he's talking about economics, and he's just talking in this dreadful monotone voice, and it keeps showing the students' faces as they're just falling asleep and not caring. The students aren't listening to him. Same situation, although it's not because this guy's boring, it's because they just are not going to pay attention to anything. He says there that they aren't paying attention. And the words that he uses there, and again, it's some of those Greek rhyming words. It's nathroi ta akoi. It's a phrase that rhymes in Greek, but we don't know that because we don't get it. So he says that you're dull of hearing, you're hard of hearing. And he uses this Greek term that rhymes and even is memorable, And he says, you are nathroi, you're dull of hearing. And that word dull, it can also be translated sluggish, negligent, lazy, slothful of hearing. And I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking like sloth, my slides. There we go. Like a sloth, he uses it, it's like you're slothful or sluggish. And he's using these kind of word pictures to describe their attention towards the things that he's saying. It's like you're a sloth or a slug. Are these like role models to you? Like, is that like, I want to aspire to be like one of those things? A sloth or a slug? Well, no, that's not really a good thing. We shouldn't be aspiring to be like these. And that second word there, of course, means hearing. And he's talking about their need to be better listeners and to hear better. And sometimes like the word hearing, the Bible talks about like, the eyes of our hearts, and talks about like metaphysical and kind of spiritual applications of like our sight and our taste. Taste and see the Lord is good. So sometimes the Bible talks about our senses, and it kind of talks about them on a spiritual level, not like actual, But here, when he's talking about hearing, this is a term that means like literally, like your hearing, literally your ears. He's like, I don't just mean like in a vague, abstract sense, like pay attention to how you're hearing or you're not listening very well generally. But he's like, no, when you hear people talk, he says, you aren't listening. Specifically me. This author of this letter had some pre-existing relationship with the church, He cares for them. We see over and over again that he has a deep love for these people, but his deep love for them, rather than keeping him from saying confrontational things, leads him to say confrontational things towards the church that he cares about. And he's saying, in a sense, I can tell that you're not listening and that you aren't paying attention. And as I mentioned already, like he said earlier, in Hebrews chapter 2, therefore we, and he includes himself in it, which is nice, but therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. That's a theme that we see again and again in Hebrews, and it's saying like, pay attention, listen up, pay attention. And finally it says that you have become dull of hearing. And there he says that, he doesn't say, you have been born dull of hearing, does he? He doesn't say that this has been the way that you've lived your entire Christian life, or, but he says, well, you have become dull of hearing. Later on in the book, he's going to remind them of previous experiences that they've had with the Lord, and want to stir them up towards that. So he says, you're people who have a history of listening well, of hearing from the Lord, of paying attention as God's word is taught and open and applied. But he says now you have become dull of hearing. As Christians, the goal is to begin at a certain point and then to progress and to grow. Even as John said at the beginning, to finish the race well. And he says to them, you aren't doing that. As a pastor, as a Christian, as someone who cares, allow me to point out that you have become dull of hearing, Hebrew Christians. Not you guys, but maybe. He says, because I love you and care for you, I want to point this out. And so rather than maybe going down that direct route of saying, well, and this is you, and all of you are dull of hearing, but just to point out the general idea that he's not being unloving in pointing this out. This is loving and caring that he's pointing something out about them. He's doing so in hopes to help them. He's doing so, and we see later on in the rest of this paragraph and the rest of the book, he is exhorting them and helping them along, but he doesn't just ignore it. Sometimes we think that to ignore something is to either make it go away, or that, sure, they'll probably just figure it out on their own. And perhaps they will. Or perhaps God is calling you to point something out to someone that you care about and that you love and that you want to see progress. And you can be used as this author was used for this church there. And so that's verse 11. About this, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing.